Hi, everybody. My name's Luke Bonwick. I'm a mill writing consultant in the UK. And today I'm going to talk about conserving mill artifacts, recording them, and also a bit about using them. Um, this is a shorter version of a longer talk that I've often given from time to time. And my work in the UK is very much related to the conservation and repair of our windmills in particular. And so these examples are just built up over my couple of decades at least of working on recording and conserving mills and creating specifications for repair work. So this is the first example. I'm going to use take three case studies, three items in particular, and look at the conservation of them. This is Upminster Mill, which used to be in Essex, now in the London borough of Havering, and this is one of our very best large smock mills that we've got in the UK, now well restored. But we're looking here particularly at an external item, which is the sack loader that was formerly fitted to the reefing stage at first floor level. I've put a ring around it here so you can see. And this is an item that when we restored the mill, we were in two minds as to whether to replace that in its context, put it back on the reefing stage here, or leave it as a museum exhibit. And what we decided to do in the event is actually to keep it as a museum exhibit, because there are problems regarding the aperture, the large hole in the reefing stage that would create, giving a problem for visitors. But you can see it's quite an interesting, unusual feature of this particular mill. It's a loading device, so the chains lift it up into a flat position, and then it will drop down again when you move the chains, and so that you can take your sacks of milled flour and load them into the waiting cart, as shown in this previous slide. So it's a very interesting and quite an unusual feature. Here is the item, and of course the problems of conservation are that we would have, if we had reinstated it in position, we would have put this item back out into the weather, where it would have continued to deteriorate. You can see this is the top of it, and the rear side of it shows vestiges of the old original white lead paint, now dulled off to a weathered grey colour. But it's still got its original chain, and as you can see at the bottom of the picture, it has been repaired at some point in the past. So this item has given us some food for thought as to how best to conserve it and display it for future generations to enjoy and be interested in. You can see that it's a fairly small item. It probably comes up to my waist, so sort of half my height. And I think that smaller items dismantled from mills are really much easier to safeguard and conserve, because generally there will be a corner of the mill or a corner of the museum building next door where you can display this item. Problems come, of course, when the elements of the mill that you're trying to conserve and record are slightly larger. And that is really when the recording need comes in a bit more importantly. So our next example is again from Essex. This is the north of the county, and this is one of our very nice brick tower mills with a dome-shaped cap at Gainsford End. This mill wasn't so fortunate as Upminster, and after the lead had been stripped off the cap roof, what we found is that it deteriorated very quickly. So by the time we looked at this mill in 2007, it was a complete wreck. What you can see here is the remains of the curb, the cast iron elements, and vestiges of the timber cap frame resting on top of the tower, but not everything had collapsed in a heap at the bottom. And this large oak timber, because it was oak, it was preserved intact on top of the mill, and we were able to dismantle this carefully and record it. Now, the recording survey was a key part of the repair of this mill, which actually has been domestically converted. And these are some of the elements, some of the components that we took out of the mill and were able to set up on the ground. And then a large measuring session took place. Anyone can measure parts of the mill, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really measure up as many historic components as you possibly can. You don't have to be very good at the survey part of it. You may not think that you can draw or measure at all, but any sketch of any quality is very important when it comes to preserving the details of this historic fabric. So the positions of bolt holes, the sizes and sections of the timbers, any details at the ends that may be lost or may be of interest, everything needs to be recorded. And you can use a number of very simple, very cheap ways of recording, such as photography. You can use as up to laser scanning of these components, but you don't need to use such high-tech methods. A simple sketchbook and a measuring tape will do just as well. And the value of measuring very carefully and looking at what you're seeing comes through here, because you can actually reconstruct parts of the mill on paper in great detail just by having a careful look at what remains. So these are two of the timbers in the cap frame. This drawing is a plan of the cap frame on top of the mill. And as you saw in the previous photo, there wasn't really much left of it. But here you can get quite a lot of accurate detail from just a set of large and fairly decrepit timber components. It's going to be very difficult, however, to preserve all of these very bad condition elements of the cap frame forever. So a drawing really does preserve a lot of the detail of them in a very accessible way. The cast iron components of the windmill are much easier. These are much more robust, and they will last a much longer time without you having to make decisions as to how best to try and conserve these large items. And this is a drawing showing the wind shaft of the mill I'm photographing there back in position. This had actually lost a large part of the rear end of the wind shaft when it was pushed from the top of the mill, and it fell 50 feet to the ground. But by being able to reconstruct the cap frame of the windmill and its key dimensions, we were able to work out exactly how long that shaft had been when it was in position. So it's a mill reconstructed on paper, sadly not in practice. The final example is from Lincolnshire, and this is a slightly different artifact in that this is a paper artifact. This is related to the mill at Alford in Lincolnshire, and this is the old mill writing company that used to operate in the same village as our very well-known five-sailed windmill. So this is Mr. Thompson outside his old workshop. Unfortunately, the firm no longer operates, and this is the workshop just before it was turned into a house, when the contents were being stripped out. But fortunately, the last proprietor of this company saw fit to save not only all the tools and equipment, but all the paperwork, the ledgers and the day books relating to this firm, which was established in 1877. Now, in this, on this windowsill here inside the building, there sat what was known as the sale book. And this was a very small notebook, which sat, as I said, sat on the windowsill, and the old millwrights had written down over several years all of the dimensions, the key dimensions for the sails of all of the windmills that they maintained over the course of however many years, 50, 60, 70 years. So these are the dimensions written down here for one of the sails of Alford Windmill. And this is all that these millwrights needed to reconstruct and make or build a new sail whenever one was needed. These key dimensions were all that was needed. And so not only is this a fascinating artifact, it's actually almost a key, it's a key component of a windmill in paper form. And so I think these items have got are much easier, much simpler to preserve than large timber and cast iron components. But they're in a way even more important to preserve and identify if possible. So I can demonstrate this by the fact that I've actually used this in the last few weeks to reconstruct and create a drawing of one of the sails, which will be built hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years. And it was very useful to have not only a surviving sail to measure, but also these dimensions that the old millwrights had used to check back on. So that's a very brief whirlwind tour of 3 artifacts that are key to the conservation of windmills in this country, and the different ways and different problems involved in conserving and recording them.
Luke, thank you very much indeed. There's some really vital information you've shared with us there. And I'm just going to actually pick on a couple of things, if I may, a couple of questions. You mentioned earlier the fact that anyone can make a drawing. And I just want to get you back. In fact, what you're showing to us on the screen right now, I think is key, because what it's saying to me is even me with my very basic drawing skills can actually make a drawing. So just remind us, what do we need in order to make a drawing to record what we're seeing in the object?
Well, I've included these examples because these demonstrate very clearly that the haste that I've used when creating records of windmills on site. Often you've got not particularly good weather, and although my finished drawings are quite tidy, these site sketches are most certainly not, but they are good enough to show the key dimensions that you need. So if we look at the one on the left, for example, this is part of the cap of a Lincolnshire windmill, the fantail frame out the back, and all I've done is put the measuring tape over the key distances on the various timbers, and I've shown the relationship between these. Now these aren't to scale, but what you really need to do is to develop an eye for detail, an eye for looking at a seemingly complicated structure and deciding and distilling that down into its key components that you can then transfer to the drawing board or the computer on the CAD program later on. So I've just used a simple notepad. You can get an all-weather notepad if you need to, and a variety of you can use a laser measurer for measuring distances, but generally just a typical square or a measuring tape will do the job perfectly well. So I've looked at the lengths of timbers, I've looked at and recorded the key sections through the timbers and the relationships between them. And what's very important is to, as I say, develop the eye for detail so that you can importantly understand your sketches when you're back drawing them up. So on the left, we've got the fantail frame of one of the mills, and then on the right, we've got the wind shaft and cross for a Lincolnshire type mill with the brake wheel in the centre inside the mill, and then the sail cross on the outside. So here I'm looking for key lengths, distances between the components, and the sizes of things. And we've gone a bit more mechanical here, so I've got a centre line running down the centre which I've started with. Again, it's not to scale; it's just sketched to by eye to start with, and then the key dimensions measured on. And where there's a small detail needed, like on the right here with the tail journal, I've done a little detail of that to show the profiling and the sizes and diameters of certain elements. So you can really build up the drawing, and inevitably there will be some dimensions that you've missed, but it's very important to just practice, because practice makes perfect.
Thank you, Luke. Well, one final question, which is, we've got the drawing. I'm going to assume that you have taken some photographs. What do we do with those to make sure that actually, even if the unthinkable happens, let's say there's a fire in the place that we're storing our drawings and our photographs, that there's the greatest chance that these can be kept for future generations?
Yeah, there are there are in the UK a lot of repositories where you can place your the records that you create. I think the most important place that you can initially store your photographic records and your drawn records is with the mill itself. Normally, there'll be a custodian of the mill if it's the owner or if it's a local friends group, and they will welcome having some of your sketches and your photographs and historical records of the mill, which they will look after. If for any reason that isn't possible, then in the UK there's a central mills archive, and that has got a very good search tool on it. So they are able to, particularly with digital, what we call born digital records. So records that aren't necessarily don't come from paper originally. They're created in digital forms. They can easily be added to the web catalogue, and then they're available online for everyone to use. So there are local archives, there are national archives, and there are site-specific archives as well. So I would certainly recommend that you don't keep all of this information necessarily to yourself, but make other people aware that you've got that information, you've created it, however incomplete it may be, because it may be the missing piece of the puzzle that fits with their information that gives a full wholesale picture of a mill, and that's what we're aiming for.
Luke, thank you very much indeed. It's been really insightful to hear to explain how you record, how you conserve, and how our mills are benefiting from your work and will do for many generations to come. It's been a great pity that we've not been able to with you live, but thank you so much for your time today. And I know that everyone will be delighted with what we've heard. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, John.